Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in despite these challenging times. Before diving into the talk, Angelina and I wanted to give a very special thank you to the CVPR conference organizers, and especially to the organizers of this great long-standing workshop on fine-grained visual recognition. So despite all of the challenges of 2020, we are very grateful to them for giving us all an opportunity to come together, to continue learning from each other, to continue sharing the latest research findings. And so we're thrilled to be here today to tell you about the latest line of work around fairness in computer vision, particularly today looking specifically at revealing and mitigating biases in visual data sets. So let's start with a grounding example. In 2017, news broke out about a photo app based off of a computer vision model that learned to increase the attractiveness of a photo. And it did so by primarily manipulating skin color. Now, putting aside the issue of why you would want to build an app for increasing attractiveness in the first place, let's ask instead, why does something like this happen? And so the standard media answer is simple, to blame the app creators, and it's an answer of just outrage and disbelief, and how could somebody do this? And part of this is definitely warranted, part of the blame is definitely warranted, but then the reality is much more subtle than that. This was not intentional. In reality, we're constantly working within this cycle where human history, bias, prejudice, and stereotypes are making their way into large scale data, which is then used to train state of the art AI models, which are then increasingly being used in making decisions, and they become part of our history. So, a research question that we've been asking in my lab is, can we adjust the AI design to mitigate these effects? And there are different places where we as researchers can intervene. So for example, we've been looking at AI models, and I want to give here a very special shout out to our main conference paper this year, CVPR conference paper on mitigating domain bias. And so this is work led by Zheyu Wang. Very welcome to check it out if you are interested. And then we also have several other works coming out shortly. But today, what we wanted to talk about is specifically interventions on the data side. So whether it be data for fine-grained recognition or collecting data for object detection or for any other tasks, what can we do to make sure that the data is not biased or less biased? How do we recognize different types of biases? How do we automatically find them? How do we mitigate them? Things like that. And so the key takeaway here, the key message before even getting to our contributions is that large scale data does not necessarily equal fair representation. So you might think that, okay, I collected all of the data that was out there, or I went online and collected, a data set with millions of examples, and that's good, but that's not enough. So simply collecting a lot of data is not going to be enough. And to dive deeper into that, let's talk about several different types of biases that have been observed in data sets, sort of in roughly increasing levels of complexity of these biases. So in 2018, Blomwini and Gebru pointed out that face data sets consist primarily of faces of people with lighter skin tones. And by primarily, I mean sort of 80 to 90% of the photographs were of people with lighter skin in these commonly used data sets. And so only 10 to 20% were of people with darker skin. So this is an example of undersampling in the data set. So we know that this is not reflective of the real world distribution of people. This is an issue with where and how the data set was collected. And so they, in this case, implemented a relatively straightforward solution, which is they went out and collected more photographs of people with darker skin, created a new data set. It was called Pilot Parliament Benchmark data set, which is a lot more balanced across these dimensions. So here's a slightly more complex example. So in 2017, Shankar and others observed the lack of geographic diversity, and this is now run on ImageNet and Open Images datasets. So as you can see from the map, the photos that were included came primarily from the US, with some also from Canada, from Australia, from Europe, but many countries and even entire continents are barely or almost not at all represented in the data. And so this is a more complex issue. So of course, some of this can be mitigated by better data collection practices. So for example, search engines used to retrieve images were translated into the search queries that were used to retrieve images were translated into different languages, but perhaps a larger, more diverse set of languages should be used here. There were multiple search engines and photo sharing platforms from which images were collected, but again, perhaps a broader set is needed. But there's also other issues at play here that are much more difficult to overcome in the context of data collection. For example, we use the web as the primary source of cheap visual data, but then this implicitly relies and assumes that people have access to the web, access to internet, so especially access on their phones, which are going to be then used to share photos, relies on people even having access to mobile phones that have good cameras, relies also on a culture that incentivizes photo sharing, and makes many other social assumptions. So, understanding what kinds of biases, so for example, in this case, geographic, cultural biases are creeping, um, are sort of creeping into the data, and then building more geographically inclusive data sets is a much more complex and challenging issue. And while we're on the topic of web search engines, so there's another factor at play. Back in 2015, so Matthew Kay and co-authors, but also many other works since then, have pointed out the bias in web search results. So for example, when you search for the term CEO, you get images primarily of white men wearing suits. And a part of this is, in fact, that we do have quite a skewed demographic among our CEOs in the real world, and then particularly a very skewed demographic among CEOs who are actively getting photographs promoted and publicized. And that's part of why this is happening. And another part is that search engines by design retrieve images that are most representative of the target concepts rather than images that are necessarily most diverse. And of course, when we rely on search engines again as our primary source of visual data, these kinds of issues really come to light. If you're interested in diving deeper into these issues, into the social effects, for example, of search engine results, there's some great books out there. So Sophia Noble's book on algorithms of oppression, for example, from a couple of years ago. Also recently, my colleague Ruha Benjamin's book on race after technology. All of these are great resources to sort of look deeper into these issues. I'll do another quick self-promotion here of a paper. So this one appeared in the Conference on Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency from our lab this year. This was led by Kaiyu Yang on constructive solutions that can be taken in a computer vision context to try to mitigate some of this search engine bias and some other issues in data sets. And so finally, this brings me to the last issue and perhaps some of the most complex type of bias that we may want to consider. And that is of stereotype representation, sort of stereotype portrayals in data sets that goes deeper than just counts, deeper than just numbers of people of certain demographics that appear. So for example, here I'm showing examples from open images of women co-occurring with flowers in the top row and men co-occurring with flowers in the bottom row. So yes, there's flowers in all of these images, and these are sort of two genders. We're simplifying here to just look at two genders of people co-occurring with the object flowers. And there may be sort of similar numbers of men occurring with flowers as women occurring with flowers. However, if you look at the photographs, the way these people of different genders are portrayed is very, very different. And these kinds of subtleties in the way people end up portrayed in data sets is very difficult to reveal simply by computing statistics of co-occurrence. And this requires a much deeper dive and a much deeper analysis of dataset bias. And so this brings me to Vibe, the visual bias extraction tool that we built recently to help reveal and mitigate biases in computer vision datasets. This work is currently under review. It is co-authored by myself, by my colleague, Professor Arvind Narayanan, who is an expert in security, privacy, and machine learning fairness at Princeton, and by my PhD student, Angelina Wang. And so now I'll proudly pass the torch on to Angelina, who is the lead author of this work, to tell you all about it.
Hi, I'm going to talk about this tool that we built. It takes in as input a visual data set and its annotations and outputs metrics, seeking to produce insights and possible actions. We aim to go beyond simply documenting underrepresentations, but looking more deeply into how the portrayals and representations of the image differ along various axes. This means that beyond just counting the number of occurrences of various objects and people with objects, we perform a number of other automated analyses that take advantage of the rich visual images in the dataset. Due to the automated nature of our tool, we are able to surface discovered patterns on large-scale datasets at a level at which human inspection would be impractical. This tool is intended to help dataset users diagnose what kinds of biases the datasets they are training their models on may contain, because these same biases may propagate into the model. This is meant to be used alongside other dataset diagnostic work, such as datasheets for datasets. Our tool is also intended to help dataset creators themselves, who can iteratively query the tool to find biases that may be present in their dataset and adjust their data collection or labeling process accordingly. Suggestions of how to counteract discovered biases are recommended, but ultimately it is up to the dataset creator to ascertain which biases are problematic, such as those that reinforce societal stereotypes, and which biases are more harmless. Our tool is available as a collection of interactive Jupyter notebooks that allow customization. Users simply supply their dataset, which includes images and annotations. Our tool then uses a combination of pre-trained models to gather additional annotations, as well as fits new models to the dataset in order to discover patterns that arise. The analysis is done along 3 dimensions, looking at object classes, people of different genders, and different geographic locations. Today, we will look into the kinds of patterns that can be discovered along one such dimension, gender. The insights we present are extracted from the COCO and Open Images datasets. We do know that for this analysis, we are using a binarized socially perceived gender label when we refer to gender, but that is not actually what gender is. We use these labels because of the annotations available to us from the datasets. These annotations are derived from both datasets using the same method employed by Zhao et al., where if a caption or annotation contains a gendered person noun, such as woman or boy, and no gendered person noun of a different gender, then the image is labeled as containing either a person who is female or male. One metric that our tool looks at is the contextual representation of what kinds of objects males and females are featured with, and what kinds of scenes they are represented in. The object categories are derived from the annotations provided with the dataset. The scenes are derived from what a pre-trained scene classifier assigns to each image, which we acknowledge will bring the biases of this model itself. In this graph, we can see the object categories ranked by those which are more represented with males and those which are more represented with females. As we can see, the trends of these objects often mirror that of societal stereotypes, which can be problematic if we do not want the models trained on these datasets to perpetuate or even amplify such biases. In this graph, we see the same thing for scene categories. Once again, the same troubling trends arise. One possible action to take at the dataset level in response to the discovery of these patterns could include collecting more images of each gender with their underrepresented objects and in their underrepresented scenes to create a more evenly distributed dataset in this regard. The next thing we will look at is the interaction between objects and people of different genders. Through this kind of an analysis, we hope to get a deeper understanding for the kinds of differences in how various genders are portrayed that may not be immediately clear from just things like co-occurrence counts. We use a derived metric of 3D distance as a proxy for interaction. The distance metric is approximated using the distance in the image and size of the bounding boxes, and validation of this as a metric is provided in our paper. Proxy metrics like this allow us to perform large-scale automated analyses on the datasets. With such metrics in hand, we can see that for this particular example of the organ instrument, when people who are female are pictured with it, they are oftentimes merely near the instrument in some way, whereas when people who are male are pictured with the instrument, they are featured actually playing it. These more subtle differences in how gender is portrayed are not captured in more basic statistics, such as counting the co-occurrences of people of particular genders with objects. The action that can be taken with this discovery is making sure that people of different genders are represented in comparable ways with different objects. Beyond looking at how people of different genders interact differently with the same type of objects, we can take advantage of the visual data we have and investigate how the same object is visually portrayed differently across genders. By fitting a model to separate images with the same object across the two genders, and then looking at what the model has most confidently classified as male and female, we can discover additional biases in the dataset. We can look to two examples from the Open Images dataset of images that contain a sports uniform and the example from earlier where images contain a flower. We can see that images of sports uniforms with people who are female tend to feature indoor sports or people in swimsuits. On the other hand, images of sports uniforms with people who are male tend to feature baseball, an area in which there is very low female visual representation in this dataset. For flower, we can again see that females and males are represented very differently with these objects, whereas we would hope that every object was represented similarly between the genders so as not to continue to perpetuate any societal biases. An action that could be taken to alleviate such disparities would be to collect more images of each gender with a particular object in more diverse situations. The last thing I'm going to talk about is a little different, because now we are identifying a problem in the annotations rather than the images. One thing you may notice in these images is that the caption, which is where the gender labels come from, mention a man in all of these images. However, upon visual inspection, it is not clear how this gender could be identified. Through further analysis, we discover the trend of gender annotations to default to male in situations where gender is clearly not discriminable in an image. This is not to say that there are situations where gender is or is not discriminable, but just that these are situations where gender should definitely not be able to be inferred. We define two such situations, which is where the number of pixels that make up the person is below a particular threshold, or when no face is detected in the image. Gender labels assigned in these kinds of situations should be pruned from the dataset, as they are not an accurate characterization of the image. In conclusion, as we try to tackle the cycle of bias, we need efforts to address the issues on all the steps. With regards to looking at the dataset, we hope to be able to better examine and understand the data so that we have an idea of what kinds of biases our models have the potential of picking up on. We can then hope to iteratively use actionable insights to constructively engage with these dataset issues, rather than simply pointing fingers at the dataset. We hope that you will download our tool and provide us with feedback. Thank you.